Gamal Abdel Nasser was one of the most consequential leaders of the Cold War era. His presidency transformed Egypt, reshaped Arab politics, and challenged the global order constructed by European powers after World War II. His speeches drew millions into the streets of Cairo and Damascus. His policies redefined what sovereignty meant in the developing world. His wars altered the territorial and political map of the Middle East for generations. From 1954 until his death in 1970, Nasser dominated not just Egypt, but the entire Arab political imagination. He nationalized the Suez Canal, defying Britain and France. He formed alliances with the Soviet Union while maintaining Egypt's independence. He championed Palestinian rights and Arab unity. He became the voice of anti-colonialism across Africa and Asia. But while Nasser's ideology, military campaigns, and diplomatic maneuvering have been analyzed in countless books, academic studies, and documentaries, his children largely disappeared from global focus after his death in 1970. They became historical footnotes, mentioned briefly in biographies of their father, but rarely examined as individuals with their own distinct life paths. 5 children grew up inside Egypt's most powerful household during the height of Nasserism. They witnessed revolutions, wars, and the construction of a political movement that would outlive their father. They had access to state power that few Egyptian families could imagine. They lived in secured residences, attended state functions, and absorbed the ideology that shaped their country's direction. And then, suddenly, in September 1970, the protection vanished. Their father died. The state apparatus that had surrounded them began to shift. A new president with different priorities took power. The children had to find their own way forward. What happened to them? This video will follow each child separately, from birth to later life. We will track their education, their careers, their families, and their relationship to their father's legacy. We will examine the choices they made and the outcomes those choices produced. No speculation, no myth-making, no dramatic reconstruction, only documented life paths based on available historical records, interviews, and verified information. Hoda Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in Cairo in 1951, 3 years before her father would lead the military coup that ended Egypt's constitutional monarchy. Her early childhood coincided with the most turbulent period of Egypt's modern transition, the consolidation of revolutionary power, the purging of rival factions within the Free Officers movement, and the establishment of what would become a single-party state under the guise of socialist transformation. The Egypt of Hoda's infancy was still technically a monarchy under King Farouk, though real power was increasingly contested between the palace, the British military presence, and nationalist military officers. By the time she could form coherent memories, her father was already president. The household she grew up in was not simply wealthy or privileged in the conventional sense. It was the physical center of Egyptian political authority, where policy was debated, where foreign ambassadors sought audiences, and where the fate of millions was decided. Security personnel surrounded the family residence at all hours. Diplomatic visitors arrived at irregular times, often late at night when sensitive matters required discussion away from official channels. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by state events, international crises, and her father's relentless work schedule. Cabinet meetings could run until dawn. Military briefings interrupted family dinners. Phone calls from Moscow, Belgrade, or Damascus came at all hours. Hoda was the eldest daughter, and in Egyptian families of that era, especially those still shaped by traditional values despite revolutionary rhetoric, this position carried specific expectations. She was expected to be well-educated, composed in public settings, and discreet about family matters. Unlike the sons, particularly Khaled as the eldest male child, she would not be groomed for political succession. Nasser's ideology explicitly rejected monarchical or dynastic politics, but she would still represent the family in public settings when protocol required a female presence, and she would be expected to maintain the dignity associated with the presidential household. Hoda's childhood unfolded in secured presidential residences that functioned as both family homes and extensions of the state apparatus. These were not ordinary houses. They were compounds with multiple layers of security, outer perimeters guarded by military police, inner checkpoints manned by presidential guards, and then the private family quarters where a semblance of normal domestic life was maintained despite the extraordinary circumstances. Visitors to these residences during the Nasser years described elaborate protocols governing access. Cabinet ministers required appointments. Foreign diplomats went through security screenings. Even family friends could not visit casually. Every guest was logged, every arrival and departure recorded. For the children, this environment was entirely normal. They did not experience the relative anonymity or freedom of movement available to other Egyptian families, even wealthy ones. They could not attend public schools without extensive security measures. They could not play in public parks. Their entire world was controlled, monitored, and filtered through the lens of state security. Education was conducted under strict supervision, often with private tutors supplementing formal schooling. Teachers were not simply qualified educators. They were vetted by security services to ensure political reliability. Classmates, when present in small group settings, were selected from families deemed trustworthy by the regime. The curriculum emphasized Arabic language, Egyptian and Arab history, and civic responsibility, reflecting Nasser's broader educational reforms aimed at instilling national consciousness in Egyptian youth and breaking with the colonial education system that had emphasized European languages and history. Hoda absorbed the political language of Nasserism not through formal indoctrination sessions, but through daily immersion. Conversations at the dinner table referenced decolonization movements in Africa, non-alignment conferences in Asia, and Arab unity projects throughout the Middle East. Her father's speeches were not just political events, they were family events. The household would gather to listen, aides would analyze the public reaction. The children would see firsthand how political rhetoric shaped popular sentiment. The 1956 Suez Crisis, when Hoda was 5 years old, was one of her earliest memories of political crisis directly affecting her family. British and French forces, in coordination with Israel, attacked Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. For weeks, the family lived under the threat of expanded invasion or even aerial bombardment of Cairo. The 1958 union with Syria, creating the United Arab Republic, brought Syrian officials into the household regularly. The 1962 intervention in Yemen's civil war meant her father spent enormous energy managing a distant conflict that drained Egyptian resources, and then came 1967. As Hoda matured through her teenage years, she developed intellectual interests that would later define her public role and give her a distinct identity within the family. She pursued higher education in Egypt, focusing on Arabic literature, history, and eventually archival studies. Unlike many children of authoritarian leaders who studied abroad in European or American universities, both to receive what was often perceived as superior education and to provide them with international exposure and connections, Hoda remained in Egypt, attending institutions that had been fundamentally reshaped by her father's nationalist education policies. This was partly a security decision. Sending the president's daughter abroad created vulnerabilities. She could be targeted by Egypt's enemies, or she might be exposed to political influences that contradicted Nasserism. But it was also ideological. Nasser had built a new Egyptian university system meant to be world-class without depending on Western models. His children studying in Egypt was a statement of confidence in that system. Hoda's academic focus gradually turned toward archival research and historical documentation. This was not a common career path for women of her generation in Egypt, even among the educated elite. Most women with university degrees entered teaching, medicine, or remained outside formal employment entirely. But archival work reflected both Hoda's personal inclination towards systematic organization and scholarship and her unique family circumstances. She had direct access to materials that professional historians could only dream of obtaining. Personal letters written by her father to other Arab leaders, internal government memoranda revealing decision-making processes, private recordings of conversations where Nasser spoke frankly about policies he publicly defended with absolute conviction. These were the 1960s, a decade of both triumph and disaster for Nasserism. The early years saw Egypt's growing influence across the Arab world and the developing nations. But the middle years brought the costly Yemen intervention, which drained resources and military strength. And then came June 1967. During this period, Nasser's health was visibly declining. The stress of governance, the burden of representing Arab aspirations, and the physical toll of chronic conditions combined to age him rapidly. The 1967 defeat had devastated him psychologically as much as physically. He aged what seemed like a decade in those 6 days. His speeches became shorter and less frequent. He appeared exhausted in photographs. The family watched as the man who had dominated Arab politics for nearly 2 decades became visibly diminished, struggling with diabetes and other ailments that his doctors could manage but not cure. Hoda was 19 years old when her father died in September 1970. She had just reached adulthood. She had completed her basic education but had not yet established an independent career or life path. Her father's death would force her to make decisions about her future in circumstances very different from those she had been raised to expect. Nasser's funeral on October 1, 1970, drew millions into the streets of Cairo. The outpouring of grief was genuine, overwhelming, and chaotic. People climbed lampposts to catch a glimpse of the funeral cortege. Some were crushed in the crowds. The scenes were broadcast across the Arab world, showing a level of popular mourning rarely seen for any political leader. For many Egyptians, particularly those who had come of age during his presidency, Nasser's death felt like the end of an era, not just politically, but emotionally and psychologically. But for his family, the aftermath brought immediate and irreversible change that had nothing to do with public mourning. The practical realities of lost power became apparent within weeks. Anwar Sadat, Nasser's vice president and a member of the original Free Officers movement, succeeded him according to constitutional procedures. Sadat had been a loyal subordinate for years, never publicly challenging Nasser's authority or policies, but he was not an ideologue in the way Nasser had been. He was a pragmatist, a survivor, someone who read political winds and adjusted accordingly. Within months of taking power, Sadat began systematically dismantling key elements of Nasserism, releasing political prisoners who had been jailed for opposing Nasser's socialism, opening Egypt to foreign investment and Western economic advisors, reducing state control over the economy, and eventually pursuing an entirely different foreign policy centered on recovering the Sinai Peninsula, even if that meant peace with Israel. For Hoda and her siblings, these policy changes meant something more personal and immediate: the loss of political protection. They were no longer the children of the sitting president. They no longer had automatic access to government resources, official vehicles, or security details. The state apparatus that had surrounded them their entire lives withdrew. Financial support that had come automatically ended. The family had to navigate a new reality in which their name carried historical weight but no institutional power. Some children of deposed or deceased leaders in other countries have been forced into exile, imprisoned, or worse. Nasser's children faced nothing that dramatic. Sadat did not persecute them. But they also received no special privileges. They were expected to make their own way as private citizens in a country that was rapidly moving in a direction their father would not have approved. Hoda did not seek political office. She did not join opposition movements or align herself publicly with remaining Nasserist factions, which were increasingly marginalized under Sadat. Instead, she turned her attention to something more concrete and less politically dangerous, preserving her father's documentary legacy through systematic archival work. In the years following Nasser's death, Hoda took on the role of organizing and publishing her father's personal papers. This was not a ceremonial task. It required sifting through thousands of documents, letters, memos, diary entries, and transcripts of private conversations, and deciding what to release, when, and in what form. She worked with historians and publishers to produce volumes of selected documents. These publications became primary sources for scholars studying Nasser's presidency, offering insights into his decision-making process, his relationships with other Arab leaders, and his private doubts about policies he publicly defended. Her editorial choices shaped how Nasser would be remembered. She emphasized his commitment to anti-imperialism and Arab dignity. She included documents showing his frustration with corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency. She avoided sensationalism and maintained a tone of scholarly seriousness. This work positioned her as the primary family voice on Nasser's legacy, but it also limited her. She was not free to pursue a separate identity or career unconnected to her father's shadow. Over the decades, Hoda became a regular presence in Egyptian media, particularly on anniversary dates related to Nasser's presidency or death. She gave interviews to television programs, newspapers, and documentary filmmakers. Her role was that of a custodian and interpreter, not a political activist. She corrected misrepresentations of her father's policies. She contextualized decisions that had become controversial. She defended his intentions while acknowledging failures. But she did not call for a return to Nasserist economics or foreign policy. She operated in the realm of historical memory, not contemporary politics. Her public statements were measured and carefully worded. She avoided inflammatory rhetoric. She did not attack Sadat or his successors directly. This restraint allowed her to maintain a public platform without triggering government retaliation, even during periods when Nasserism was officially discouraged. Hoda married and had children. Her descendants carry the Nasser name, but they have largely stayed out of public life. Unlike political dynasties in other countries where children and grandchildren of famous leaders seek office or build independent careers in politics, Nasser's descendants have been notably absent from Egyptian electoral politics. Hoda's role as the family spokesperson has been consistent for more than 5 decades. She is now in her 70s. She continues to participate in commemorations, grant interviews, and oversee the management of her father's archive. Her life has been defined by a single task, ensuring that Gamal Abdel Nasser is remembered on terms she considers accurate. Whether she has succeeded is debatable. Nasser remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern Arab history, admired by some as a champion of dignity and condemned by others as an authoritarian who led Egypt to disaster. But Hoda has ensured that his voice in the form of documents and recordings remains accessible. That is the legacy she chose. Mona Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in 1954, 2 years after the Free Officers' coup and during the consolidation of her father's power. Her early childhood coincided with the height of Nasserism, the Suez Crisis, the nationalization of industries, and Egypt's emergence as the leading voice in Arab politics. She grew up in the same secured environment as her siblings, but with even greater restrictions on public visibility. While Nasser's sons occasionally appeared in state photographs, his daughters were almost entirely shielded from media exposure. This was consistent with Egyptian cultural norms of the era, which emphasized privacy for women in prominent families. Mona's education followed the same supervised pattern as Hoda's. She attended elite schools in Cairo and was insulated from the social and economic struggles facing ordinary Egyptian families during the 1960s. Being Nasser's daughter meant living under constant surveillance and protocol. Every outing required security approval. Social interactions were limited to vetted families. Marriage prospects were scrutinized not just by parents, but by intelligence officials concerned with national security implications. For Mona, this meant that personal choices carried political weight. Her father's regime was built on anti-Western, anti-Israeli, and pan-Arab principles. Anyone entering the family would be expected to align with these values or at least avoid public contradiction. Despite these constraints, Mona developed her own personality and interests. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent, reserved, and aware of the responsibilities her name carried. In 1966, Mona married Ashraf Marwan, a young Egyptian from a wealthy family with connections to the military and political elite. Marwan had studied at Cairo University and had impressed Nasser's inner circle with his intelligence and discretion. The marriage had Nasser's full approval. Marwan was soon brought into the presidential apparatus, working as a liaison and aide. He had access to sensitive information and participated in meetings involving military planning and diplomatic strategy. This was not unusual. In political systems built around personal loyalty, family members and trusted associates often held positions that would be formalized bureaucratic roles in other governments. Marwan's proximity to Nasser was both a privilege and a burden. Mona, as his wife, occupied a unique position. She was not a political figure herself, but she was married to someone with direct access to state secrets. This would later become a source of intense controversy. Through Marwan, Mona was indirectly connected to some of the most sensitive decisions in Egyptian governance. She was present at family gatherings where military officials and diplomats discussed regional crises. She knew about diplomatic initiatives before they were publicly announced. She understood the internal tensions within Nasser's government, but she maintained the expected discretion. She did not speak publicly about political matters. She did not give interviews or issue statements. Her role was entirely private. This changed after Nasser's death. When Nasser died in 1970, Ashraf Marwan's position was uncertain. Sadat was not a Marwan ally, and many of Nasser's closest aides were sidelined or pushed out entirely. But Marwan managed to retain influence. He continued working in intelligence and diplomatic roles under Sadat, even as the new president dismantled much of Nasser's legacy. Marwan's continued access puzzled some observers. He was Nasser's son-in-law, yet Sadat trusted him. This contradiction would fuel decades of speculation. In the early 1970s, Marwan and Mona relocated their family between Cairo and London. Marwan's work increasingly involved international contacts, particularly with European governments and business interests. The family lived comfortably with wealth that exceeded what a government salary would provide. Mona raised their two sons in this environment, one foot in Egypt, one in Europe, and always aware that their family name carried both prestige and risk. In the decades following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, rumors circulated about Ashraf Marwan's true loyalties. Israeli intelligence officials eventually claimed that Marwan had been one of their most valuable assets, providing critical information that shaped Israeli military planning. Egyptian officials denied this, insisting that Marwan had been a double agent, feeding false information to Israel while gathering intelligence for Egypt. The truth remains disputed. For Mona, this controversy was devastating. She was Nasser's daughter, married to a man accused of betraying Egypt to its greatest enemy. Whether the accusations were true or false, the damage to her family's reputation was immense. Mona maintained silence. She did not give interviews defending her husband. She did not issue public statements. Her privacy, which had been a feature of her entire life, became a necessity. Mona and Ashraf Marwan had two sons. Both were educated in Europe and pursued careers outside politics. They inherited their mother's preference for privacy and their father's complexity. In 2007, Ashraf Marwan died in London under suspicious circumstances. He fell from the balcony of his apartment building. British authorities investigated the death as potentially suspicious, but no definitive conclusion was reached. Theories ranged from suicide to murder, orchestrated by intelligence agencies seeking to silence him. Mona became a widow. She continued living in London, far from the political turbulence of Egypt. She rarely appeared in public and gave no interviews about her husband's death or the espionage allegations. Her withdrawal from public commentary has been total. Unlike her sister Hoda, who became the family's public voice, Mona chose complete invisibility. Whether this was by preference or necessity, it has defined her later life. Khaled Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in 1949, the eldest son and second child overall in the Nasser household. His birth came during a period of profound political instability in Egypt, before the Free Officers' coup of July 1952, before his father's consolidation of power, before the Egyptian Republic even existed. The Egypt of Khaled's infancy was still a constitutional monarchy under King Farouk, though the system was deeply corrupt, and the British military maintained significant influence through their continued control of the Suez Canal and military bases. By the time Khaled was old enough to understand the world around him and form lasting memories, his father was president of a new Egypt, a revolutionary Egypt that had broken with its monarchical and colonial past. He was raised not as a prince in a hereditary system, but as the son of a leader who had seized power through military force and claimed legitimacy through anti-colonial nationalism and promises of social justice. The eldest son, Khaled, carried symbolic weight that was impossible to escape, regardless of official ideology. In Arab political culture, deeply rooted in both Islamic tradition and pre-Islamic tribal customs, the eldest son is often seen as the natural inheritor of family leadership, authority, and responsibility. This expectation exists even in republican systems that officially reject dynastic succession. People looked at Khaled and saw, whether consciously or not, a potential heir, someone who might one day carry forward his father's mission and ideology. But Nasser was building a republic, not a monarchy. His entire political legitimacy rested on the claim that he had overthrown a corrupt king and replaced hereditary privilege with meritocracy and revolutionary commitment. He publicly rejected dynastic politics and frequently criticized Arab monarchies, particularly the conservative oil-rich Gulf states, for nepotism, corruption, and subordination to Western interests. Egypt was supposed to be different. Leadership would be earned through revolutionary credentials and popular support, not inherited through bloodlines. This created a fundamental contradiction in Khaled's upbringing. He was raised as the son of a president with all the privilege, exposure, and expectations that entailed, but he could not openly aspire to inherit power. He could not be groomed for succession the way a crown prince would be. He could not receive formal political training or be given official positions in the government or military that would prepare him for future leadership. To do so would contradict everything Nasserism claimed to represent. Khaled's childhood was immersed in revolutionary politics from the earliest moments of conscious awareness. He was not simply a child who happened to have a famous father. He was a child whose entire environment was structured by revolutionary transformation and political mobilization. He attended state functions where Arab leaders gathered. He listened to his father rehearse speeches that would be broadcast to millions. He witnessed the construction of Nasserism as both a coherent ideology and a personality cult that made his father's image ubiquitous throughout Egypt and much of the Arab world. The 1956 Suez Crisis occurred when Khaled was 7 years old enough to understand that something serious was happening, but young enough that the details remained unclear. What he understood was that his father had taken a bold action, nationalizing the Suez Canal, that had provoked military attack from Britain, France, and Israel. The family lived under threat of aerial bombardment. Foreign forces occupied Egyptian territory, and then, through a combination of American pressure on the European powers and Soviet threats, Egypt won a political victory, even though it had been defeated militarily. His father emerged from the crisis as a hero across the Arab world. The 1958 union with Syria, which created the United Arab Republic, happened when Khaled was 9 years old. He saw Syrian officials moving through the presidential residence. He heard discussions about merging military commands, economic policies, and political systems. The union was supposed to be the first step toward comprehensive Arab unity, the realization of the pan-Arab nationalist dream. It collapsed 3 years later in 1961 when Syrian military officers launched a coup and withdrew from the union, a failure that devastated Nasser politically, even though he publicly claimed it was only a temporary setback. The 1962 intervention in Yemen's civil war unfolded throughout Khaled's early teenage years. Egyptian troops were sent to support Republican forces against royalist rebels backed by Saudi Arabia. The intervention became a quagmire, draining resources, costing lives, and achieving no clear victory. Khaled saw his father dealing with military reports of casualties, supply problems, and strategic frustrations. This was not the triumphant revolutionary expansion that Nasser's propaganda depicted. It was a difficult, costly conflict with no satisfying resolution. Khaled was educated in Egyptian schools, but under conditions very different from ordinary students. Heavy security surrounded him at all times. His classmates were carefully selected from families considered politically reliable. His teachers understood that they were educating the president's son, which meant their curriculum and methods were subject to scrutiny. This environment fostered both privilege, access to resources, and attention that other students could not receive, and isolation from the lived realities of most Egyptians who were struggling with economic stagnation, food shortages, and the limitations of a state-controlled economy. Through all of this, Khaled developed a strong personal identification with his father's ideology. Unlike some children of authoritarian leaders who rebel against their parents' politics or seek to distance themselves from controversial legacies, Khaled embraced Nasserism. He believed in Arab nationalism as the path to dignity and independence. He believed in state-led development as the solution to economic underdevelopment. He believed in anti-imperialism as both a moral principle and a practical strategy. He internalized these beliefs not as abstract theories, but as fundamental truths about how the world worked and what justice required. The 1967 war was a turning point for Khaled, as it was for all of Egypt, for Nasser personally, and for the Arab nationalist movement as a whole. Khaled was 18 years old when Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 6 days of fighting that June. The speed and totality of the defeat were stunning. The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the war's opening hours. Egyptian ground forces in the Sinai were routed. Israel seized the entire Sinai Peninsula, reaching the Suez Canal. It also occupied Syria's Golan Heights, Jordan's West Bank, and East Jerusalem, tripling its territorial control. The defeat shattered the Nasserist narrative of Arab strength, unity, and inevitable victory over Israel. For nearly 2 decades, Nasser had built his political legitimacy partly on the promise of confronting Israel and supporting Palestinian rights. Egyptian propaganda had consistently depicted the Arab military as powerful and advancing toward liberation of Palestine. The 1967 defeat revealed this as fantasy. The Arab armies were not just defeated, they were humiliated. Nasser's immediate response was to offer his resignation in a televised speech on June 9th. He accepted responsibility for the defeat and announced he was stepping down. The speech triggered massive street demonstrations across Egypt, with millions demanding that he remain in power. Whether these demonstrations were entirely spontaneous or partly organized by remaining elements of the state apparatus has been debated, but the emotional response was real. People could not imagine Egypt without Nasser, even after such a catastrophic failure. Nasser agreed to stay, but he was a diminished figure. His health deteriorated rapidly, the stress exacerbated his diabetes and heart condition. His speeches became less frequent. His public appearances were carefully managed to hide his physical decline. The remaining 3 years of his life were spent trying to recover from the defeat, securing Soviet military aid to rebuild the armed forces, launching a war of attrition along the Suez Canal, and attempting to maintain Arab unity despite the disaster. For Khaled, the 1967 defeat was deeply personal. It was not just an abstract policy failure, it was his father's failure. It discredited the ideology he had been raised to believe in. It called into question everything Nasserism claimed to represent. A different person might have responded by rejecting that ideology, by concluding that if the results were this catastrophic, the underlying principles must be flawed. But Khaled did not respond that way. Instead, he doubled down. He interpreted the defeat not as evidence that Arab nationalism was misconceived or that Nasser's policies were fundamentally flawed, but as a result of insufficient commitment to revolutionary principles. In his view, Egypt had lost because the revolution had not gone far enough, because compromises had been made, because the old social and political structures had not been fully dismantled. The solution was not less Nasserism, but more, deeper commitment, greater sacrifice, more thorough transformation. This response would define Khaled's political trajectory for the rest of his life. He became not just a defender of Nasserism, but its most uncompromising advocate, unwilling to acknowledge that the ideology itself might contain fatal flaws. When Nasser died in 1970, Khaled was 21 years old. He had just reached adulthood. He had never known a life outside the presidential palace. Suddenly, he was the son of a dead president in a country moving in a different direction. Sadat's policies were a direct repudiation of Nasserism. The 1973 war restored some Egyptian pride, but it was followed by the Camp David Accords, which established peace with Israel, something Nasser had vowed never to accept. Khaled watched as Egypt abandoned non-alignment, opened to Western investment, and distanced itself from the Soviet Union. He saw the dismantling of Nasser's economic policies and the rehabilitation of figures his father had jailed or exiled. He could not remain silent. Khaled became active in Nasserist political circles. These groups were small, marginalized, and under surveillance, but they maintained ideological purity. They opposed Sadat's economic liberalization, condemned peace with Israel, and called for a return to Arab nationalism. Khaled's involvement gave these groups symbolic legitimacy. He was not just another activist, he was Nasser's son. His presence at meetings and rallies was a statement. The president's own heir rejected what Egypt had become. This activism brought him into conflict with the state. Sadat's government tolerated some dissent, but it also cracked down on groups deemed threatening. Khaled's activities were monitored. His movements were restricted. He was periodically detained for questioning. Over the years, Khaled faced multiple arrests and accusations. He was accused of involvement in unauthorized political organizing, of maintaining contacts with foreign entities critical of the Egyptian government, and of attempting to destabilize the state. The details of these accusations varied, and much of the evidence was never made public. In authoritarian systems, political charges often serve broader purposes than simple law enforcement. Khaled's arrests functioned as warnings, both to him and to remaining Nasserist factions. Khaled repeatedly denied the more serious allegations. He insisted he was engaged in legitimate political activism, not subversion or violence. Supporters framed him as a victim of political persecution. Critics argued he was exploiting his father's name to avoid accountability. The truth is difficult to establish. Court documents and police reports from this era are incomplete or inaccessible. What is clear is that Khaled remained a thorn in the side of successive Egyptian governments. Despite his political activism, Khaled maintained a family life. He married and had children. His wife and children stayed largely out of the public eye, avoiding the scrutiny that followed Khaled himself. His relationship with his siblings varied. Hoda focused on archival work and historical memory. Khaled focused on contemporary politics. Their approaches to honoring their father's legacy were fundamentally different, and this sometimes created tension. Khaled's descendants did not follow him into political activism. They pursued professional careers and maintained distance from Nasserism. This generational shift reflected broader changes in Egypt. By the 2000s, Nasserism had lost popular resonance. Khaled Gamal Abdel Nasser died in 2011, just months before the Egyptian revolution that toppled Hosni Mubarak. He was 62 years old. He had spent his entire adult life attempting to preserve and promote an ideology that Egypt had largely moved beyond. His death was noted in Egyptian media, but it did not spark the kind of national mourning his father's death had. He was remembered as the son who stayed loyal to Nasserism, for better or worse. History's assessment of Khaled is mixed. Some see him as a principled defender of anti-imperialism and Arab dignity. Others see him as a man unable to move beyond his father's shadow, clinging to an ideology that had failed to deliver on its promises. What is undeniable is that Khaled made a choice. He could have pursued a quiet private life, as some of his siblings did. Instead, he spent decades in political opposition, paying a personal price for his convictions. Abdel Hakeim Gamal Abdel Nasser was the youngest son, born in the mid-1960s during the period of Nasser's declining health and political fortunes. He was a small child during the 1967 war and its aftermath. Unlike his older siblings, who had memories of Egypt at the height of Nasserism, Abdel Hakeim grew up in a household shaped by defeat and exhaustion. His father was increasingly ill. The optimism of the 1950s was gone. What remained was determination to salvage Egypt's dignity, but the confidence was broken. Abdel Hakeim's memories of his father are those of a young child, fragmentary, impressionistic, shaped by brief interactions rather than deep conversations. He was only 5 years old when Nasser died. In later interviews, Abdel Hakeim described a father who was frequently absent, consumed by work, visibly tired. He remembered quiet moments, sitting in his father's study, listening to recordings of speeches, watching aides come and go. These memories, while personal, lacked the political context that shaped his older siblings' relationships with their father. For Abdel Hakeim, Nasser was less an ideological figure and more simply a father who died too soon. After Nasser's death, Abdel Hakeim's upbringing continued in a household led by his mother, Tahia Kazem. She ensured her children received proper education, but she also shielded them from the political pressures that had engulfed Khaled. Abdel Hakeim pursued technical education, focusing on engineering. This was a practical choice, reflecting both personal aptitude and a desire for professional stability outside the political sphere. Engineering offered clear career paths and economic security, things that political activism did not. He completed his education in Egypt and entered the private sector. He worked on infrastructure projects, industrial development, and technical consulting. His career was entirely separate from his father's legacy. Abdel Hakeim married and raised a family. He maintained a low public profile, avoiding media appearances and political events. Unlike Hoda, he did not become a public interpreter of Nasser's legacy. Unlike Khaled, He did not join opposition movements. His choice was deliberate. He wanted a life defined by his own achievements, not his father's name. This was difficult. People still recognized the name Nasser. Journalists still sought interviews. But Abdel Hakeim consistently declined. He lived comfortably but not lavishly. His engineering career provided middle-class stability. He was not wealthy by the standards of Egypt's business elite, but he was far from struggling. In the 2000s, Abdel Hakeim began making occasional public statements, usually related to historical documentation rather than contemporary politics. He participated in efforts to authenticate recordings of his father's speeches and private conversations. Audio technology had advanced significantly since the 1960s. Old recordings could now be cleaned, restored, and analyzed. But this also created opportunities for manipulation and forgery. Several recordings attributed to Nasser circulated online, and their authenticity was disputed. Abdel Hakeim worked with audio experts and historians to verify which recordings were genuine. He provided context about when and where certain recordings were made. His technical background made him well suited to this work. He could discuss recording equipment, audio quality, and technical markers of authenticity. Abdel Hakeim's role in preserving his father's legacy was quieter than Hoda's, but still significant. He focused on factual accuracy rather than ideological interpretation. He was not interested in arguing whether Nasser's policies were right or wrong. He simply wanted the historical record to be accurate. This approach allowed him to engage with scholars and researchers across the political spectrum. Left-wing historians cited his testimony about recording dates. Right-wing critics acknowledged his honesty about his father's mistakes. Abdel Hakeim represented a different model of legacy management, not advocacy, not activism, but documentation. He remains alive and occasionally contributes to historical projects, though he still avoids broader public engagement. Abdel Hamid Gamal Abdel Nasser was the middle son, born in the early 1950s during Nasser's consolidation of power. He grew up in the same environment as his siblings, secured residences, state functions, and constant surveillance. Details about Abdel Hamid's early life are sparse compared to his siblings. He was not the eldest son, so he did not carry Khaled's symbolic weight. He was not the youngest, so he did not have Abdel Hakeim's narrative of growing up after the decline. He occupied a middle position that attracted less attention. From an early age, Abdel Hamid showed less interest in politics than his older brother Khaled. He was academically inclined, but his interests leaned towards subjects with practical applications rather than ideology or history. He completed his education in Egypt and pursued professional work unrelated to government or politics. Reports suggest he worked in business or technical fields, though specifics are difficult to verify due to his insistence on privacy. Unlike Khaled, who sought the spotlight as a defender of Nasserism, Abdel Hamid actively avoided it. He did not give interviews, he did not attend political rallies, he did not involve himself in debates about his father's legacy. Abdel Hamid's professional life has remained almost entirely private. He did not seek positions in government. He did not leverage his family name for business advantages. He simply worked, earned a living, and maintained distance from public life. This deliberate obscurity was unusual. Most children of famous leaders either embrace their inherited status or publicly reject it. Abdel Hamid did neither. He simply ignored it and lived as if his last name did not matter. Whether this was sustainable is unclear. People still knew who he was. Journalists occasionally tried to contact him, but he consistently refused engagement. Abdel Hamid married and had children. His descendants have been even more invisible than he has been. They do not appear in media reports. They do not participate in commemorations of Nasser. They have effectively exited the historical narrative entirely. This generational disappearance reflects a broader truth. Political legacies dilute quickly when families do not actively maintain them. Without Hoda's archival work or Khaled's activism, the Nasser name would likely have faded from public consciousness much faster. Abdel Hamid's family represents the road not taken, a complete withdrawal from legacy management and historical memory. Abdel Hamid's relationship with his father remains undocumented. He was old enough to have real interactions with Nasser before his death, but young enough that those interactions were still shaped by childhood dependency rather than adult conversation. After Nasser's death, Abdel Hamid's mother, Tahia Kazem, played a central role in raising the younger children. She emphasized education, stability, and discretion. She did not encourage political activism. She wanted her children to have normal lives as much as that was possible. Abdel Hamid's choices suggest he took this guidance seriously. He honored his parents by living quietly and raising his own family without scandal or controversy. Abdel Hamid represents a specific kind of legacy choice, complete disengagement. He is Nasser's son by birth, but he has rejected the responsibilities and burdens that come with that identity. This choice has protected him. He has not faced the legal troubles Khaled did. He has not endured the scrutiny Mona did. He has not spent decades managing public expectations like Hoda has, but it has also rendered him historically invisible. Future biographies of Nasser will focus on Hoda's archive, Khaled's activism, and Mona's tragic connection to espionage. Abdel Hamid will be a footnote if he is mentioned at all. Whether he sees this as a success or a loss is unknown. He has never said. 5 children grew up in Gamal Abdel Nasser's household during one of the most consequential periods in modern Arab history. Each made different choices about how to carry the weight of that name. Hoda became the family's public voice, dedicating her life to preserving and interpreting her father's documentary legacy. Mona married into power and scandal, spending decades in the shadow of espionage allegations. Khaled embraced political activism, spending his life defending Nasserism even as Egypt moved on. Abdel Hakeim pursued technical work and historical documentation, engaging with his father's legacy on factual rather than ideological terms. Abdel Hamid withdrew entirely, choosing privacy over public memory. None of them became president. None of them built independent political careers of significant weight. None of them escaped their father's shadow, but none of them fully inhabited it either. Their lives illustrate a fundamental truth about political legacies. They are burdens as much as privileges. Gamal Abdel Nasser changed Egypt and the Arab world. His children spent their lives navigating the consequence of that change, each finding their own way to survive the inheritance. This is what happened to Gamal Abdel Nasser's children.